I've dedicated my career to studying businesses and markets, how they succeed, and how they fail over the long haul. But I'm seeing a dynamic in Washington today that mirrors some of the most destructive patterns I've seen in the corporate world. It's a pattern that rarely concludes positively, and it's worth discussing, not as a political statement, but because the fundamentals of sound and unsound leadership are universal, whether you're managing a balance sheet or a government. I'll start with a core belief. Loyalty is only valuable when it's reciprocated. The best ventures I ever entered were founded on mutual respect and shared principles. My partnership with Charlie Munger lasted decades because our trust was absolute. It was a two-way street. Neither of us ever worried about being sacrificed if the waters got choppy. We certainly had our disagreements, but we never doubted the other's basic integrity or their commitment to our shared enterprise. When loyalty becomes a one-way obligation, however, you no longer have a partnership. You have something much closer to a capture, where one side extracts all the value and the other assumes all the risk, with no reciprocal guarantee. What I'm observing in Washington today looks dangerously like that second model. It's unsettling because I've watched this exact dynamic ruin companies, end careers, and tear down institutions that took generations to construct. The former House Speaker, Mike Johnson, is learning a painful lesson many have learned in business before him. Temporary alignment should never be confused with a durable partnership. Johnson went all in on his commitment to Donald Trump, defending him through every legal challenge and political firestorm. Some may look at that and see admirable conviction or backbone. But when I view it through the lens of decades spent analyzing organizations, it looks like investing your entire life savings into one speculative pre-revenue startup. It might pay off. I've seen long shots win. But the exposure is immense. You have no diversification. You have no hedge. You've left no margin of safety for your own errors, or, just as importantly, for the errors of the other party. In this instance, that risk is crystallizing. Johnson's whole political career was pegged to a single relationship, and that relationship now seems to be fracturing. That is not a secure position for anyone to be in. I am not here to choose political sides. I've known fine people in both the Republican and Democratic parties. My purpose is to discuss the consequences of leadership failure and institutional breakdown, because the fallout from that affects every one of us, regardless of our political leanings. Johnson's refusal to engage with Democrats, from what I can gather, isn't rooted in a belief that he can extract a better outcome by waiting. It appears to be driven by a fear that any deviation from the script will erode his standing with a specific political base. He's labeled negotiating as ransom, which is a line that might resonate on television but does not constitute leadership. When both sides refuse to engage and resort to blame, the resulting damage propagates through the system exactly like high inflation in a weak economy. I remember the 1970s well. Once inflation gets traction, it infects everything. The cost of goods rises, savings are devalued. The entire system is impacted. That is a precise analogy for this dysfunction. It moves from one institution to the next until the whole apparatus is compromised. The government remains closed. Federal employees miss pay. The markets start to price in the uncertainty. Even the president seems fine with the stalemate, providing no clear exit ramp or constructive engagement. I'm not privy to the private discussions, but the public posture suggests no one feels the urgency to find a solution. I have always said that doing nothing is, itself, a decision. And in this case, it's an incredibly expensive one for the nation. In the corporate world, a crisis isn't managed by exacerbating it through disengagement. You find a path forward. You make necessary compromises. You stabilize the institution. I recall the 2008 financial crisis. Many terrible decisions had to be made. People had to swallow their pride, abandon their preferences, and collaborate to stave off a complete meltdown. It was messy and imperfect, but it was essential. The individuals who led us through that didn't do so by refusing to speak to the other side. There is a business principle I've held for decades that applies here. Do not concentrate all your assets in one investment, especially if that investment is inherently volatile. Johnson staked his entire political methodology on a single relationship. He neglected to build alliances across the aisle, or even with moderate voices in his own party. His entire portfolio was in Trump. Now, he's discovering the consequences when that loyalty is not returned. Trump has attacked his strategy on the shutdown and labeled his budget ideas as reckless. I don't use that term casually. In my world, calling a proposal reckless means it exposes the organization to an untenable level of risk for no appropriate reward. That is a grave charge, coming from the very person Johnson had tied himself to. It's not a mere policy disagreement. It represents a complete depletion of political capital. The signal sent to the Republican ranks is chilling. Your loyalty is not an insurance policy. The moment your perceived utility declines, you cease to be an asset and become a liability. When a CEO begins treating dedicated executives as interchangeable parts, it speaks volumes about the corporate culture. It means allegiance is not seen as a long-term value. It is purely a short-term transaction. The guiding philosophy becomes, what is your value to me today? When that occurs, the most talented people either leave or they shift their focus from protecting the company to protecting themselves. You get a surge of CYA behavior, everyone documenting everything, ensuring they can't be held responsible when things go sideways. That is what I see in Washington. There is more concern for individual political positioning than for effective governance. The focus is on how an action will be perceived on cable news rather than on whether it actually addresses the problem. This is a formula for organizational collapse, whether in a corporation or a government. Trump's move to discard one of his most loyal allies isn't just a personal slight. It's an institutional signal. It communicates to every other Republican that loyalty is not a fixed-income asset. It is a speculative option. You can vote in lockstep, defend him through every crisis, and sacrifice public credibility for partisan advantage. But if your political value falls, you will be liquidated. There is no warning, no parachute, and no severance. You are simply gone. That message spreads with incredible speed. Capitol Hill is now filled with legislators who are realizing their careers are dependent on an individual with no long-term allegiances. That is a deeply unsettling realization. It is akin to working for a company where the CEO terminates people erratically, where security is non-existent, and where today's star performer is tomorrow's scapegoat. I have seen organizations like that. They do not have a long shelf life. Why? The real talent departs, leaving behind only those who either cannot find work elsewhere or those who excel at internal politics rather than at the actual job. I have witnessed this exact dynamic in the corporate world repeatedly. When a dominant executive treats people as expendable, it fosters what we'd identify as a toxic culture. Employees stop focusing on the long-term health of the organization and start thinking only about personal survival. They stop taking intelligent risks. They stop raising their hands when they spot a flaw. They just try to avoid the blast radius. When that shift occurs, the company stops innovating, stops growing, and eventually, it fails. I recall a specific company in the 1980s. I won't use the name, but it was led by an incredibly overpowering CEO. He was brilliant in many respects, charismatic, and a phenomenal salesman for his vision, but he had zero tolerance for dissent. He couldn't stand being questioned. So what was the result? Every smart executive who had the courage to push back, to say, "Hold on, I see a potential flaw here," was either fired or left. He was left surrounded only by people who told him exactly what he wanted to hear. Within a few years, that company made a series of disastrous moves that drove it straight into bankruptcy. Why? Because no one in that room was willing to say, "This is a terrible idea." They knew what happened to those who spoke up. That is the peril of this leadership style. The damage isn't confined to the one person treated unfairly. It's about the corrosion of the entire organization's culture and its capacity to function. When people become afraid to speak the truth, afraid to voice concerns, afraid to say, "I believe this is a mistake," that is when organizations make their most profound errors. Concurrently, we've seen notable protests erupting nationwide. with people mobilizing over concerns about accountability and the imbalance of power. I'm not going to debate the specific attendance figures. Those are always contentious and difficult to confirm, with different groups reporting different estimates. The precise tally is not the important data point. The important signal is that when a large segment of the population feels the system is failing them, it demands attention. In financial markets, we watch what people do with their money, not just what they say. When capital flees a specific sector, it tells you something is wrong, even if the root cause isn't immediately obvious. The same logic holds true here. When citizens are agitated enough to physically demonstrate, taking time away from their lives to be heard, it signals a depth of concern that should not be ignored. In economics, a monopoly warps the free market. In a democracy, concentrated, unchecked power warps the political process. When the public loses confidence in its institutions, the entire structure begins to fracture. There has been significant public debate over various social media statements from officials. I won't dive into those specific incidents. It's not my expertise, and I find focusing on individual flare-ups to be unproductive. But I will offer this as a governing principle. When leaders must rely on shock value rather than substantive policy, the institutions they lead are weakened. If a CEO I employed spent their days generating controversy online instead of managing the business, the board would have pressing questions. We would ask, why are you not focused on operations? On strategy? Why is your energy being channeled into creating drama? Trust is accumulated over decades, but can be vaporized in a moment. I have spent my entire life building Berkshire Hathaway's reputation for integrity, for honoring our commitments, and for dealing fairly. That reputation holds more value than any number I could write down. But it could be annihilated by one catastrophic decision, one falsehood, or one breach of faith. Right now, a tremendous amount of trust is being rapidly depleted in Washington, on all sides. When institutions lose their credibility, when the public no longer believes the system is impartial or that its leaders are acting in good faith, the cost is immeasurable. But let's look at the context, because it's important. Mike Johnson assumed the speakership in late 2023, following Kevin McCarthy's removal. McCarthy was ousted, recall, after he made what appeared to be a pragmatic choice. He struck a deal to keep the government open. That single action, which was fiscally responsible, was seen as a betrayal by the most rigid ideological bloc within his party. I am not suggesting McCarthy was a perfect leader, but he made a decision that averted a crisis, maintained government operations, and protected federal employees and public services. For that, he was ejected. Consider the signal that sends. It communicates that pragmatic governance is a punishable offense. It states that preventing a national crisis is subordinate to ideological purity. When any organization begins to penalize compromise and reward confrontation, it ceases to be about management and becomes entirely about performance. And as we know in the market, drama doesn't create value. Execution does. Results do. Johnson, learning from this, presented himself as 100% aligned with Trump from day one. Some saw this as conviction. I saw it as a high-risk strategy with zero diversification. In investing, we hedge. We protect our downside. If we buy a security, we might buy an option to protect against a sudden drop. It's not a bet against our own judgment. It's just prudence. Johnson placed an all-in bet on one relationship, one stream of political support. He was operating in financial terms with extreme leverage. It magnified his potential upside, but left him with a dangerously thin margin of safety. When your entire political viability rests on the approval of one person, any disagreement becomes an existential threat. One deviation, one independent thought, one choice based on your own judgment rather than Trump's preference, and your entire position is compromised. The protracted government funding stalemate and the predicament Johnson faces is what I would term an impossible equation. As I understand it, soldiers are going unpaid. Federal functions are stalled. This is all over a spending bill, an issue that requires negotiation, not grandstanding. I have negotiated many deals. The best ones are always those where both parties feel they gained something. It's not about crushing the other side. It's about finding a sustainable solution. Johnson's job should be to provide stability, to mediate between political pressures and national needs. Instead of leading, he has become a symbol of indecision. This is the outcome when influence is over-leveraged and leadership is absent. In the business world, failing to make payroll is a five-alarm fire. When core operations cease, boards take immediate, decisive action. Yet in Washington, we are witnessing an avoidance of accountability, as if the tangible consequences are irrelevant. Federal employees are enduring real financial suffering. This isn't abstract. This is profound pain for actual families. These are people with mortgages, groceries to buy, and medical expenses. They are not responsible for this stalemate, but they are its primary victims. As this drags on, their situations grow more dire. Some are likely facing impossible choices between paying for utilities or for food. This is unacceptable in the wealthiest nation on earth. It was reported that Johnson initially held a rigid line. No compromise, no deviation. But as pressure grew from different constituencies, federal employees, governors, even some Republican donors, he started to reconsider. He raised the possibility of bipartisan talks, of actually sitting down to solve the problem. It briefly appeared that responsible governance might prevail. But in a system that prioritizes loyalty tests over tangible results, any independent action is framed as betrayal. I am not aware of the private conversations and will not guess at them. What I can do is analyze the observable pattern. When Trump publicly attacks officials who were previously considered allies, it injects profound uncertainty into the organization. This isn't speculation. It is observable history. We saw it with Jeff Sessions, who was publicly berated and forced out after recusing himself from an investigation, as Justice Department rules required. We saw it with Bill Barr, who lost favor after stating that investigations had found no evidence of significant election fraud. We saw it with Mike Pence, who was abandoned after he followed his constitutional duty on January 6th. This analysis isn't about their specific policy positions. I am not judging whether they were right or wrong on the issues. I am pointing to a clear pattern where total loyalty is required, but is never reciprocated. In corporate governance, if senior management is fired for following established procedure or for stating facts, it is a massive red flag to shareholders. It signals that the organization prefers compliance over competence and appearance over integrity. Over the long term, that behavior destroys value. Kevin McCarthy walked this same road. Complete alignment, relentless support, no public dissent. He was, by all measures, a strong supporter of Trump, voting with him and defending him. The instant he compromised with the other side to prevent a national crisis, that support vanished. He was not protected. He was discarded. Johnson is now facing a similar dynamic. When I analyze this pattern, I am not seeing traditional politics. I am seeing an organizational design that punishes adaptation and rewards only absolute submission. This is what concerns me. In business, the companies that thrive are adaptable. They are the ones that can say, "This strategy is not working. We must pivot." The companies that go under are those that cling to a failing plan out of pure rigidity, even when all the data and a changing environment demand a new approach. They fail because they value consistency over results. A healthy organization, whether a company or a government, requires people who are willing to tell you the unvarnished truth. It requires systems that measure performance, not fealty. It requires leaders who make difficult choices based on the long-term health of the institution, not on short-term popularity. I have always tried to surround myself with people who will tell me I am wrong. Charlie did it constantly. I valued it because I am not perfect. None of us are. What I am observing in Washington is the inverse of that. Decisions are being made based on a fear of retribution, not on a desire for achievement. This is an unsustainable model. In the long run, organizations that run on fear always break. They may appear strong for a time. They might even post good quarterly numbers, but eventually the internal rot becomes visible. The top talent flees. The problems that were papered over begin to surface, and what looked like strength is revealed as profound fragility. Some of Johnson's most vocal critics are from within his own party. Setting aside the specific insults, I can tell you this. When the most severe criticism is internal, it is a sign of deep structural failure. In business, when board members begin publicly challenging the CEO, or when major investors start liquidating their shares, you know the foundation is compromised. The issue is no longer about one person. It's about the functionality of the entire system. I've seen this in companies where the culture sours, factions develop, people abandon shared goals in favor of tribal goals. The operating question shifts from, how do we make this company win? To, how do I protect my turf and undermine my rival? When that happens, corporate performance is the inevitable casualty, as all energy is diverted to internal politics rather than external competition. The predicament Johnson finds himself in is what I would term an impossible calculation. To retain the backing of Trump, he must presumably continue to obstruct any cooperative efforts with Democrats. This implies extending the shutdown, worsening the dysfunction, and solidifying the perception that his party is incapable of governing. In business, this is analogous to rejecting a life-saving merger just to appease a single, dominant shareholder, even as all your customers are fleeing to the competition. It may pass for loyalty in the immediate term, but it is reputational self-destruction in the long term. Conversely, if Johnson performs the actual duties of his office, negotiating, compromising, and restoring functionality, he is almost guaranteed to incite a revolt from the most ideological wing. This is the snare. His allegiance is not being measured by his effectiveness, but by his absolute compliance. It's a framework designed for failure. When you build a system that punishes people for doing their jobs competently, you will inevitably end up with people who stop trying to do their jobs and focus only on survival. This brings to mind a lesson from early in my career. I was evaluating an investment in a company that, on the surface, looked solid. It had good revenues, decent margins, and a strong market share. But as I spoke to the employees, I heard a recurring theme. We spend more time managing internal rivalries than managing the business. That was all I needed to hear. I passed on the investment. Unsurprisingly, that company's performance cratered within a few years, because the energy that should have been dedicated to customers and products was being consumed by office politics. In the investment world, we have a specific term for this: key man risk. It describes a vulnerability where the success of an entire enterprise hinges on a single person. If that one individual departs, becomes incapacitated, or simply changes their mind, the entire investment can unravel. Prudent investors actively diversify to mitigate this precise exposure. You never want your entire net worth bound to one company, one industry, or one person. Yet the Republican Party, in its current iteration, appears to have wagered its entire political capital on one figure. This isn't a political judgment. It is a risk management assessment. And from that perspective, it is profoundly unstable. What I am observing is the direct consequence of an organization that has failed to diversify its leadership and strategy. When a single individual holds the power to retract support arbitrarily, it introduces what we call systemic volatility. No one can be sure of their standing. No one can make long-term plans. Everyone defaults to a defensive posture. When an entire organization is on defense, innovation ceases, strategy calcifies, and the institution begins to decay from within. The secondary effects are clear if you look for them. There is a palpable anxiety spreading through the caucus. If an individual as dedicated as Johnson can be publicly attacked and weakened, then no one's position is stable. That kind of profound uncertainty doesn't just impact individuals. It paralyzes the entire organization's capacity to act. In business, when your workforce spends its time worrying about internal dynamics rather than external competition, productivity collapses. The same is true of government. I have managed Berkshire Hathaway for a long time. A core lesson I've learned is that you must keep your people focused outward. They should be thinking about the customer, the product, the competition, and the opportunities. You never want them focused inward, worrying about how to stay in the boss's favor or how to avoid being the next one out the door. When that internal focus takes over, the organization is no longer effective. People ask me what I predict will happen. The truth is, I don't know. I don't engage in political forecasting any more than I try to guess next quarter's stock movements. What I can do is tell you what history shows happens in these situations, based on the patterns I've observed. When an organization's culture becomes toxic, when tests of loyalty supersede metrics of performance, and when short-term reactions replace long-term planning, a few outcomes are predictable. First, you get constant churn. A new person comes in, attempts to navigate the impossible demands, inevitably fails to satisfy the conflicting pressures, and is forced out. Then the cycle repeats. This is incredibly costly, in business and in government. Every transition represents a loss of institutional memory, fractured relationships, and wasted time ramping up a new leader. Consider the sheer amount of energy spent on leadership elections in recent years. Energy that was not spent on governing, solving problems, or serving the public. Second, you see a deterioration in the quality of talent. When the metric for success is compliance rather than competence, you naturally select for people who are good at complying, not people who are good at leading. Over time, the talent pool itself degrades. The best people, those with options, leave for environments where they can be effective. You are left with either those who cannot get a better opportunity elsewhere, or those who excel in chaotic political environments. Neither is good for the long-term health of the institution. I've seen this dynamic repeatedly. When a company prizes loyalty over ability, a slow decline in quality begins. The truly talented people simply go elsewhere. Third, you get escalating dysfunction that eventually forces a correction. In business, that correction might be a market crash or a hostile takeover. In politics, it's often an electoral rebuke. Sometimes, the correction is an internal collapse, when the structure can no longer support its own contradictions. But eventually, any system built on an unsound footing will fail. The variable is the amount of collateral damage incurred before that correction arrives. My deepest concern isn't about one politician or a single bad decision. It is the systemic erosion of institutional standards that took generations to establish and can be dismantled in just a few years. In business, we assign real value to brand and reputational capital. These are tangible assets that appear on a balance sheet. Governments possess analogous assets: public trust, legitimacy, stability, and predictability. When those assets are depleted, they cannot be quickly replenished. The cost of rebuilding them is astronomical. I've lived through many political eras in my 94 years. I have seen both parties make significant errors. I've seen excesses from both the left and the right. I've seen strong leaders and weak leaders from both sides. But the current situation feels different, not because the challenges are greater, they have been great before, but because the institutional guardrails feel so much weaker. And when the guardrails are weak, the odds of driving off the cliff go up exponentially. Think of it as driving on a narrow mountain pass. The guardrails are not there to impede your progress. They are there to prevent a catastrophe. When they are strong, you can navigate the dangerous road with confidence. When they are rusted or missing, you must proceed with extreme caution. And even then, one small error can be fatal. That is an accurate description of our institutional landscape today. The very mechanisms designed to keep the system from self-destructing are weaker than at any other point in my lifetime. In my world, a critical skill is differentiating signal from noise. The noise is the daily chatter, the headlines, the drama, the social media posts. The signal is the underlying fundamental trend that truly dictates long-term outcomes. Washington is currently producing a deafening amount of noise, but the signal I am receiving is one of institutional degradation. It is a system where short-term tests of allegiance have crowded out long-term strategic governance, where personal fealty often matters more than procedure, and where fear is a more powerful motivator than ambition. This is not a sustainable model, not for a company and not for a country. When you design a system around the whims of one person rather than around durable principles, you are, in effect, building on sand. It may stand for a while, particularly if the weather is calm and the conditions are favorable. But when the storm comes, and a storm always comes, the entire structure is vulnerable. It lacks a sound foundation. Now, I don't want to be entirely pessimistic. Systems are capable of correcting. Organizations can be reformed. But a correction requires first an acknowledgement that there is a problem. It requires individuals to prioritize the health of the institution over their personal standing. It demands that long-term vision overcomes short-term incentives. At this moment, I am not seeing much evidence of that kind of thinking. I see a lot of people focused on protecting their own positions and their own political viability, with little regard for the long-term integrity of the institution. I see more people trying to survive than trying to lead. I understand the impulse. When the environment punishes leadership and rewards compliance, rational people become risk-averse. It's basic human psychology. But when everyone becomes risk-averse at the same time, when the entire organization is just trying to stay quiet, you get the worst possible outcomes. The problems don't vanish just because people are afraid to name them. They compound, they metastasize, and eventually they become crises that cannot be ignored. The government shutdown is a prime example. With every day that it persists, the costs multiply. Federal workers get deeper in debt. Agencies fall further behind. Public faith in government erodes. These are not abstract costs. They are real and they are growing. But solving it requires an act of political courage, for someone to stand up and say, "This is failing. We must change course." And in the current climate, that kind of risk-taking can be a career-ending move. This is the definition of a broken system. When the price of doing the right thing is higher than the price of doing nothing, you have created incentives that guarantee failure. In business, we would say this organization requires a deep restructuring. It needs new governance, new lines of accountability, and new metrics for success. The same is true in politics. But restructuring is difficult and painful. It requires those in power to cede some of that power. And people rarely do that voluntarily. I've long held that an institution's quality is defined by its worst habits, not its best intentions. Any organization can look good in a bull market. When the money is flowing and there are no crises, everyone looks like a genius. The real test is pressure. How does the organization handle dissent? How does it treat the person who delivers bad news? How does it weigh short-term demands against long-term necessities? These are the questions that expose true institutional health. And when I apply those questions to Washington today, the answers are not encouraging. I see dissent being punished, truth-tellers being marginalized, and short-term posturing being rewarded. That is a textbook formula for organizational decline. The principles are identical, whether you are managing a Fortune 500 company or the U.S. Congress. The irony is that those most responsible for the dysfunction likely view it as strength. They see it as ideological conviction, as holding the line, as a refusal to compromise. But there is a vast difference between being principled and being rigid. Principles mean you know what is non-negotiable, and you are willing to find common ground on everything else. Rigidity is a refusal to bend on anything, even when bending serves your ultimate objective. In business, I have always strived to be principled but flexible. My integrity, my honesty, my commitment to fair dealing, those are not for sale. But on most other issues, I am willing to listen, to adapt, and to find creative solutions. That flexibility has been fundamental to Berkshire's success. If I had demanded my way on every single deal, we would have missed countless opportunities, made adversaries instead of partners, and become a relic of the past rather than adapting to the future. The same applies to governance. There are, of course, core values that must be defended absolutely. Constitutional rights, the rule of law, basic dignity. Those should never be on the table. But the vast majority of governance is technical, practical problem-solving. How do we fund the government? How do we manage resources? How do we balance competing needs? These are not questions with a single, morally pure answer. They demand negotiation, compromise, and an acknowledgement that people of goodwill can disagree. What is so troubling today is that this kind of practical governance has been rendered almost impossible. Every issue has been escalated into a test of allegiance. The budget is no longer a budget. It is a referendum on your loyalty. Negotiation is synonymous with betrayal. When you frame every decision in such absolute existential terms, you make governing impossible. Governance is the act of finding common ground, and the cost of that impossibility falls squarely on ordinary people. The federal workers who can't pay their bills, the families reliant on government services, the businesses needing permits, the veterans awaiting benefits, the seniors applying for Social Security. These people have no interest in political theater. They just need the system to work. And for many of them, it is not working. I've often said that in investing, you must be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful. A similar rule applies to governance. You should be most worried about the health of your institutions when everyone else is obsessed with short-term political victories. We currently have an intense focus on winning the next news cycle and placating specific factions. We have very little focus on whether the system itself is healthy, sustainable, or effective for the American people. That is what keeps me awake. It isn't a specific policy. I've lived through administrations I agreed with and administrations I disagreed with. That is the normal functioning of a democracy. What is not normal is when the system itself begins to seize up. When the basic machinery of government fails, when the institutions designed to outlast any single leader begin to atrophy, that is the danger. Because when the system breaks, the consequences are profound and lasting. Trust is hard-won and easily lost. Legitimacy is a fragile asset. Stability requires constant upkeep. You cannot just assume these things will persist on their own. They require active protection and a willingness to sacrifice short-term gains for long-term institutional health. I don't have a simple solution. The problems are complex, they developed over time, and they will not be solved quickly. But I am certain that the current trajectory is not sustainable. Something must give. Either the incentives must be realigned to reward governing rather than posturing, or the people must change, replacing grandstanders with those willing to do the hard work. Or the system itself must be reformed with new rules that make it harder for one person or faction to hold it hostage. My fear is that nothing will change until the system suffers a catastrophic failure. That is the worst of all outcomes. Gradual, difficult reform is always better than sudden collapse. But reform requires an admission that the problem exists. And at the moment, I see very little acknowledgement. I see too many people acting as if everything is fine, while the foundations are visibly cracking. That is not sustainable. It is not responsible. And in the end, it will not work. In my business, I have always believed in confronting reality, no matter how unpleasant. Bad news never improves with age. The faster you acknowledge a problem, the more options you have to address it. The longer you wait, the fewer and more painful your options become. By the time a crisis is undeniable, you are no longer in prevention mode. You are in triage mode. And triage is always more expensive and less effective than prevention. I fear we are heading for triage. The problems are visible. The institutional weakness, the short-term focus, the decay of norms. These are not secrets. But they are not being addressed, because doing so would require the very leadership that the current system is designed to punish. It is a self-perpetuating vicious cycle. And vicious cycles do not break themselves. They require an intervention. What gives me some measure of hope is that Americans have seen worse. We have survived a civil war, Great Depressions, and world wars. We have had periods of profound corruption and dysfunction, and we have always found a way through. Not always elegantly, but we endured. The question is whether we will do so again, and at what price. The institutions we rely on, Congress, the courts, the executive, are not perfect. Their designers knew they were creating an imperfect system, but they also knew it was superior to the alternatives. They intentionally built in checks and balances because they understood that power, when concentrated, invariably leads to abuse. Those checks and balances are now eroding. That should concern every citizen, regardless of their party. I will leave you with this. In investing, the most perilous moment is when you believe the rules don't apply to you. when you think you are so brilliant or so different that the laws of gravity and value can be ignored. That is when the biggest falls happen. I see a lot of that pride in Washington. I see a lot of people who believe they have found a way to break the rules without consequence. But the rules are there for a reason. Institutions matter. Norms matter, not because they are perfect, but because they are the only framework we have that separates us from chaos. When we treat them as mere obstacles rather than as vital protections, we are playing a game of extraordinary risk. It is like removing the brakes from your car to go faster. It works, right up until the moment you need to stop. I cannot predict how this specific chapter will conclude. I do not know if Mike Johnson will retain his job or lose it, or how long this shutdown will last. What I do know is that the underlying structural weaknesses do not get solved by one election or one new leader. They require sustained, genuine reform and a collective willingness to place the health of the system above any personal or partisan gain. Until we see that commitment, we will continue to lurch from crisis to crisis, with each one chipping away more of the foundation. That is not speculation. That is just pattern recognition. And the pattern I see right now is deeply, deeply troubling. It is the kind of pattern that if I saw it in a company, I would not walk away. I would run. Thank you for your time. I realize this is not my usual subject, but sometimes you must speak to what you are observing, even when it is uncomfortable. The principles of sound management do not change from a boardroom to a capitol, and we are currently witnessing what happens when those principles are ignored. I only hope we recognize the cost before it becomes too high to pay. This isn't about party. It's about whether we have a system that works. And on that measure, I am concerned. But I am also hopeful, because I know this country can overcome great challenges. We just have to find the courage to face this one.